Thank you and welcome to Conversation 1 of our Fall Symposium, Made in Cambridge, What's Happening in Kendall Square. I'm Marika Van Dam, Executive Director of the Cambridge Historical Society. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and a lot of new faces. How many people here are members of the Cambridge Historical Society? Raise them high and proud. Excellent. Thank you for being members. The good news is that if you aren't yet a member of one of the most revolutionary historical societies in the country, you can join tonight, and there's information out front. We're a private nonprofit, which means we don't receive any city, state, or federal funding for our operations. We rely on the generosity of Canterbridgians like you to continue programs like these, so thank you. In addition to the generous support of our members, we also rely on small and large businesses here in Cambridge. I would like to thank the sponsors for this year's Fall Symposium. Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, and I will say that Alnylam has been wonderful. They recently hosted our History Cafe last week, and if you were unable to make it, I'm really sorry because it was amazing. So thank you, a special thank you to Alnylam. Alexandria Real Estate Equities, Cambridge 7 Associates, Cambridge Trust Company, Capital One Cafe, and they provided some of the delicious coffee out front. Eastern Bank, Leader Bank, North Cambridge Cooperative Bank, and Whole Foods, who also gave us some snacks. So thank you to those sponsors. I'd also like to extend an extra special thanks to our 2017 lead sponsor, IRB Real Estate, for sponsoring an entire year of community programming and exploration. So thank you. Another thank you to the Cambridge Public Library for hosting our event. It's a gorgeous space and such a wonderful community resource, so thank you to them. So why is the Cambridge Historical Society holding a symposium about what's happening in Kendall Square? Because we believe in more than just history for history's sake. We think that history is useful. And because we believe that the history of our city is relevant to our lives, we, as an organization, decided we were going to focus on issues that our city is facing today and offer the historical perspective. Just as we did last year, we've asked a question that affects everyone in Cambridge. What does Cambridge make? You probably already know about our impressive manufacturing history: candy, bricks, soap, glass. It's a list we should be proud of and celebrate. But what do we make now? How does what we make connect us to each other and our community? How are we as creative beings expressing ourselves through what we make? And how does that creativity come across in our physical landscape? What effect does making have on our city, now and in the future? Last year we talked about housing, an issue on everyone's minds and a very important topic worth discussing because we all live in homes. This year is just as important because most of us are or were workers. And when we think about growth and change in manufacturing and jobs here in Cambridge, we think of Kendall Square. It's the place to look for answers to the question of what Cambridge makes now and how what we make changes our city. Holding this symposium is one way we are trying to help Cambridge think and talk across our usual divides. We use history as a tool to think differently. We believe knowing history will help us problem solve better and smarter. Our goal is to slow down these citywide issues and use history to examine them. We're asking each other, how did we get here? What happened and why? If I see a problem, what's my role, my responsibility in solving this problem? That's history's job, and that's the job of our historical society. We use stories, your personal experiences, your history, to make sense of the world and this city today. Thank you for being a part of this effort. Before we get started, I wanted to review some ground rules. They can also be found in your conversation guide. 1, active listening. Pause and repeat back in your head what you heard before speaking or raising your hand. Don't just hear, absorb. 2, ask questions based on genuine curiosity. 3, think and speak with empathy. Be like a historian, that is, understand that the life circumstances swirling around a person is what led them to a decision. Think about these conditions before passing judgment. And 4, be specific. Describe concrete details and your own experiences, and avoid ideas that mean something different to other people. Let's try to avoid cliches, assumptions, and stereotypes. So a little bit of housekeeping. Tonight's event features a discussion between our 3 speakers and our moderator. We will then open up the conversation to you. We have note cards where you can write down your questions if you don't want to raise your hand. Please remember to state your question clearly with a question mark at the end. What we discuss will not be forgotten. As with all of our events, we take notes on what we talk about and we put them in our archive. It is important to us that your account of Cambridge history gets told. We know that not all sides of history are recorded, and it's important to us that going forward they are. Tonight's event is being recorded by our friends at CCTV for a future airing. You can follow tonight's event and comment along on Twitter. Our handle is CambridgeHS, and our hashtag tonight is Made in Cambridge. The speakers from both conversations have sent us suggestions for further reading, and more information is available in your guidebook and available on our website. Finally, there's a survey included in your guide. It's on that yellow sheet. Please fill it out. We listen to what you say, we take it seriously, and we try to do better. So please help us out. I'm pleased and honored to share the stage today with such great Cambridge experts for tonight's discussion. Tonight's moderator, Henriette Davis, needs little introduction to the people of Cambridge. She's a longtime public servant, serving on the Cambridge School Committee beginning in 1988, before joining the City Council in 1996. She served as mayor of Cambridge in 2012 and 2013. In January 2014, she retired from elective office to pursue other interests, such as awareness of global climate change, attending both the United Nations Climate Change Conference and the Paris Climate Talks. Henrietta graduated from the University of Rochester, holds a master's degree in social planning from Boston College Graduate School of Social Work, and a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School here in Cambridge. She's spoken about Cambridge worldwide, including a trip to Heidelberg University to discuss how urban design techniques can be used to replicate the success of Kendall Square. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Henriette Davis, and the rest of our speakers.
Thank you very much. This is quite a challenge. We're here tonight to talk about one of the biggest things that's happening in the world and do it in about a half an hour before we open it up to questions. So we're going to start, I'll tell you a little bit about myself as a city councilor and mayor, how Kendall Square had an impact on my life. I would say that not one city council meeting goes by that we don't talk about Kendall Square one way or the other. That the growth and development of this fabulous worldwide biotech center has been a cause of both pride and challenge to growth. The question of how do we both have a wonderful city and have this a place where we're going to solve the world's problems. The city council wrestles with that every week. And I actually have a list here of all the parameters that are discussed about Kendall Square all the time. And I gotta say, I think we've done a pretty good job of balancing these things out, but it doesn't come without events like this, opportunities to discuss these issues, and opportunities to make kinds of trade-offs to build the kind of community we have. I had a slideshow in the presentation I made in Heidelberg. Believe it or not, this really happened. I really went to Heidelberg to talk about Kendall Square because the University of Heidelberg said, how can we do what you did? And I said, okay, I'll tell you all I know. But one slide showed where, how much biotech there was in a bunch of top 12 communities across the world. There's nothing that compares to Kendall Square. Really, absolutely nothing. And I'm supposed to ask that question, but I'm going to tell you that is already the answer. So I'm right now going to introduce the panelists this evening, our esteemed panelists. We have here to my left Dr. Robin Wolfe Scheffler. He hasn't been around very long, 3 years, but he's catching up real fast. He's a historian of biology and medicine in the MIT program in Science, Technology, and Society. We call it STS, right? Because they always have initials there. He studies the history of the biological and biomedical sciences in American society, and he currently focuses on the history of the biotech industry. Previously, he was a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His first book, A Contagious Cause, The Search for Cancer Viruses and the Growth of American Biomedicine, will appear in 2018. I think he's just told us he has to finish it this week or something like that. Is that right? Be looking for that book. His current project focuses on the history of biotechnology in the Boston area. To his left, we have Mr. Sam Lipson. Sam was raised in Cambridge from 1964 until he left for college in 1982. He returned in 1982. Here's the period. Then he returned to Cambridge and helped establish the Environmental Health Division of the city's Public Health Department, becoming its first director in 1998. Sam has 20 years of experience in public health risk assessment, biological safety, environmental health policies, and other environmental health subdisciplines. Sam organized the Cambridge Biosafety Forums and has done so since 2002, offering biosafety training to community members, biosafety professionals, and public health officials. Prior to coming to the health department, Sam was an analytical chemist in Massachusetts and California. He holds a BS from the University of California, Berkeley, and completed his MS coursework at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Welcome. And to his left is Dr. Phillip Sharpe, who arrived in Cambridge in 1974 to start working at MIT's newly opened Center for Cancer Research, housed in building, you guessed it, it has a number, E17, a converted chocolate factory, at a time when the most significant restaurant in Kendall Square was, who knows the answer to this question? What was the most significant question in significant restaurant in Kendall Square? Oh, you're the F&T Diner. Isn't that right? That's the truth. The F&T Diner. And located at the site of the current outbound T-stop. He has made his professional life in Cambridge ever since. He's an institute professor, the highest academic rank at MIT, and a member of the Department of Biology and the Koch, how do you say that? You don't like those guys, but Koch Institute for same guys. And they do some good. Integrative Cancer Research. Dr. Sharpe is co-founder of Biogen and Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, Inc. So you have before you a panel of experts on the beginning of biotech, the burgeoning of biotech, and we want to know who you are. So we know that many of you are members of the Cambridge Historical Society, and we want to know how many of you live in Cambridge. Raise your hand. Oh, there are a few outliers. How about, have you lived here for more than a year? More than 5 years? Uh-oh, here we go. More than 20 years? More than 30 years? How many people work here in Cambridge? That's a pretty good showing. And how many in Kendall Square? How many work in Kendall Square? Not so many. They're still at work. That's probably what it is, right? And I guess we found out that not all of you know about the F&T Diner, though some of us are great fans. Did anyone express a concern about the changes happening in Kendall Square in the 60s and 70s? Were any of you concerned when all this was happening around DNA? And did you write a letter? Did you appear? Bill, did you? You did. Anybody? Guilty. Anybody else who was a part of that? I know some of you, and I recognize the DNA, when we were talking about the RDNA hearings back then. Well, you're going to hear about that, I think. And the last question, which is a trick question. First of all, do you know what Necco wafers are? Okay. All those who like Necco wafers, raise your hands. All those who are not so sure, raise your hand. And any people who just can't, no to Necco wafers except chocolate. Chocolate? Who like the chocolate Necco? Oh, our panelists voting on Necco wafers. Very good. Okay, well, let's get down to business. Now we know about the candy part of things, and we know that actually that is the backdrop of all this development. There were candy factories in Kendall Square. They were an important part of the work life of people in Cambridge. Many worked in the candy factories. And now there's still, I think, maybe one candy factory. June, you can smell the Junior Mints if you're on Main Street. But the Sugar Daddies have moved to Revere, I think. But that all changed. And the question is, how did it turn to biotech? How come what were the conditions that were ripe for changing Kendall Square then, the candy factories? I think there was a place where they were doing the hose factory, the simplex wire and cable was acting central, but it was industrial fundamentally. How did that change to become something that's so different? Anybody want to hazard a guess, Phil?
I think it's very important to recognize that the whole biotech thing in Cambridge came out of Harvard recruiting Jim Watson in the 50s. Watson had discovered the structure of DNA in 53. That was really the landmark of the whole molecular genetic DNA revolution. And Harvard recruited him in the late 50s. And MIT recruited Salvador Luria, who was his mentor. He trained Jim Watson and recruited him at MIT. And both universities developed a group of faculty interested in DNA and molecular biology. And out of that community, 20 years later, there developed the ability to do the joining of DNA and genetic engineering, and then there was significant work around the world. But that was a real breakthrough. And it was seeded here with Harvard and MIT. And when Biogen, for example, started in 1978, everyone in the pharmaceutical industry told us that we wouldn't be able to survive 2 years as a new company, primarily because you couldn't get the resources financially to ever think about making a pharmaceutical out of new technology. What they underestimated was the receptivity of Wall Street to genetic engineering. But that led us then to have to recruit new people into the company, and that required us really essentially to be next to a university. So when Wally Gilbert and myself here in Cambridge, working with Biogen, we were both co-founders with 6 European scientists, we decided that the company had to have its headquarters located near MIT because the land near MIT was less expensive than Harvard Square, and that it would needed to be on the Red Line because many people would want to commute. The students would be able to live and commute and gain access to the company on the Red Line. So we took a space across from Binney Street, across MIT on the east side of Binney Street. And that was Biogen 1 in about 1980. It was then the headquarters of Biogen. Biogen started in 78 in Geneva, Switzerland, but the headquarters came to Cambridge in 1980. And I'm pretty sure we got the first genetic engineering license for a private sector company in Cambridge.
Number 3 after Harvard and MIT.
After the private sector. Okay. So this whole dialogue in Cambridge created a community that was informed about this technology and was ready to say, if you will do it, like the universities carry out these experiments, we are comfortable with you having a headquarters here in Cambridge.
So it seems like Robin wanted to jump in here, and I think why don't I let you do that? But we also want to get to what that critical point in time when, which I think Sam can speak to, about the regulatory environment that and which you were alluding to, which allowed all this to go forward in this community in a predictable way. But Robin, did you want to jump in now?
Yes, thank you. I guess what I would say from a historian's perspective is that when we interpret what's happened, there's always that tension between what ends up happening, founding of Biogen, the growth of Kendall Square into this sort of unique center of biotechnology, and what might have happened, or all the things that could have gone wrong along the way. And if you look at the United States after the Second World War, many people thought Philadelphia was going to be essentially what Kendall Square became. And for various reasons, it didn't work out. People also looked towards the suburban sort of tech environment that Stanford created as another model. And so from that perspective, the fact that biotech clusters within Cambridge as opposed to going out to the Route 128 suburbs like many of the high-tech companies did in the 50s and 60s is remarkable. So the one thought that I have as a historian is that in addition to what happens and understanding that, there's also sort of understanding all the other things that might have happened along the way. And those are questions that I guess maybe, I'm originally from Berkeley, California, so maybe my analogy is surfing, where there's sort of the wave and there's how you ride it. And you don't really get a good run unless both of those things are in conjunction. And I'll be talking a bit more in this discussion later about maybe some of the elements of the wave as well as the rider. So that's all I'll say for now.
Would you like to fill us in a little bit about the regulatory environment that might have made a difference?
Yeah, I think I can help a little, and I think Phil can probably add some as well. So I come at it from a couple of different perspectives. One is professional. My training, after I left Cambridge, I went to Berkeley, lived in California for 10 years, studied toxicology, accidentally ended up working for the city that I grew up in, and I would say felt like it was a perfect combination of my interests, my personal history, my interest in the science of poisons and the science of risk. And it just, sometimes things happen, they fall together, and this one just kind of happened. I did not plan to be in public health, but I ended up here. So part of my perspective is coming in as somebody who understands risk and thinks about it. But my particular professional and academic interest was really around how we translate these concepts to the public. How do we talk about probabilistic risk? How do we talk about things we cannot be certain about? And yet people have to make real decisions on the basis of that. Again, great coincidence that this happened to be a conversation that was already underway here in Cambridge and had been since I was 7 or 8 years old, but worked really well with the background that I had. Another perspective that I think I come at this from is that I grew up in Cambridge. I went through alternative public schools in the city. Our family was friends with a number of the people who were involved especially on the skeptical side of this question, but really on both sides. So I get to hear their version. I've heard Dr. Sharpe's version. I've read a number of histories of this, and I've also heard specifically from the individuals like Dr. Ruth Hubbard, who were involved at that time. I know their kids pretty well. It's sort of an in-the-family event to some extent for me. I also have strong recollections of what Cambridge was like back then. I was very curious about cities and how they were organized. I was curious about the city council. I used to attend those meetings when I was about 11 or 12 for some reason. And I was first brought into politics by somebody who was a senior to me at the Cambridge Pilot School, who is now the mayor of New York. So there was just in the air a crackling interest in policy, even among kids. And that has continued to be the case, I think, in Cambridge. So all of these have, I think, brought my point of view on what went on, those conversations from the early and mid-'70s going forward, not only as a specific response to a specific policy problem, which is how you address uncertainty in an emerging technology field, but something that was going on in the 70s very much at the same time, which was the collapse of faith in institutions. Not just academic institutions and political institutions. This was, the time that I came of age. And when I look back at the arguments being made by those who were skeptical of the safety and the implications of the science of recombinant DNA, I think a lot of people who have observed this as well, that this was a broader problem than just that one. It was about how do we know and how do we trust what we're being told? And what is the obligation of the university to be accountable to the community and be transparent in a way that goes beyond checking boxes, right? So I see the decision on the part of the city eventually to regulate this work, not to prevent it, but to regulate it, but to create a fairly impressive public involvement process as part of it, as the culmination of a lot of what Cambridge had to offer, not just on the side of science, but on the side of accountability and good policy and good process, and trying to claw back faith in institutions.
I think it might be difficult to understand some of that for some people in the audience if you don't have a brief history of what happened. So I have talked about molecular biology and gene science, and in the mid-50s, about not 50s, 1975, some critical experiments were done where DNAs were linked together and put in bacteria. And these were DNAs from human cells, or in frog in this specific example, Cohen and Boyer at San Francisco and Stanford linked together and put in bacteria. And for the first time in the history of man, we had the technology to do synthetic biology, to actually create genetic material, new organisms with new properties. And this was announced, in the New York Times and all the major newspapers. There was a concern that using this technology, you could create a pathogen who, for example, could have a tumor gene that you had in a bacteria that you took into your body, and that could create, for example, cancer. So there was a debate as to how safe this technology was to be used. The debate led to the National Academy of Science in Washington calling for a moratorium in the use of this technology until guidelines could be issued as to how to proceed safely, or with diligence as one proceeds these experiments. And that happened in 1975, and it was a worldwide moratorium. Though labs around the world were all ready to do this experimentation, it was pretty straightforward, they abstained for about 6 months. And then there was a meeting held in California called the Asilomar, and at the Asilomar, about 150 scientists assembled. There was debate, and then there was guidelines issued. I was at Asilomar. It was one of my great formative experiences. Mm-hmm. But Mayor Lucci here in Cambridge said, well, Cambridge is not the rest of the world. Cambridge is Cambridge, and we're going to have our own debate on the safety of this technology and how it should be used in Cambridge. And therefore, the city council passed a moratorium that said until Cambridge had its guidelines, or did produce guidelines for doing this research, this type of research could not go on in Cambridge. Obviously at MIT, and I was a professor there, and at Harvard, that was a restriction that wasn't too popular. So, but lived up to. And there was a dialogue between the city government of Cambridge, the manager and the council, and MIT. There was a process put in where a committee was appointed to look at this technology, make recommendations, and after a period of about 6, let's say 9 months or so, Cambridge passed its guidelines. And those guidelines were similar to the federal guidelines. Sam can tell you more details about it. But it did require a engagement of the citizens of Cambridge into committees that overviewed this science at MIT and at Harvard. And those committees are still there. But when Biogen came in 1980, the city said, if you will adhere to these guidelines, we've had the debate, everybody's comfortable with these guidelines. If you will adhere to these guidelines, you can establish your private sector lab in Cambridge. And for a commercial company to have the certainty that you wouldn't start to build a building and recruit people, and then there would be guidelines put in place that said you can't do this in this town. That uncertainty was just a kiss of death. So these guidelines really did have a big impact on making Cambridge an attractive place to begin this type of technology. And the universities were here, as I mentioned before, and students were here, and that created a fertile environment for this type of research.
Well, I certainly had heard the story, and Mayor Lucci was always at the center of it, and I assume that there are people here in this room who also remember Alva Lucci, who was a very colorful mayor of the city, who, I guess some people think that's an understatement, and he wanted to make sure that the public was involved, and that talk about transparency. I mean, I don't think anything was really happening unless it was happening right there in the city council. Though I myself was post this discussion, I was not post serving with Alva Lucci, and I know that the style that he brought to it, and I wonder, this makes me wonder, is this something that happened in any other kind of process anywhere else similar to this? Because this was so important to have that predictability. I know it's about DNA, but are there other things? I think about the BU, the labs, the biohazard labs, and so on. It seems as if somehow Cambridge, and maybe I'm pride of place, but is able to deal with these things through these kinds of process. And I don't know if you can reflect on that at all, about that kind of process approach.
I will say there was a lot of work in the very early 80s looking at what happened in Cambridge and what happened in communities around the country at the same time. I think it's reasonable to say, I think this mic is on, yes, that Cambridge put the marker out first, that it was not inappropriate for a local community to have direct input into scientific enterprises if they had a potential impact on that community. That, having put that out, there were a number of other communities that had similar discussions, but from what I can tell in looking back at many of those communities, this was something they felt obliged to do at the time, but it didn't stick. And part of it is that over time, the work was understood to be less risky than they once thought. There were fewer unknowns over time. But I also think it was right down the middle for this community to have this debate, because it wasn't just one debate. There were 2 or 3 debates going on here, as we discussed earlier. There were questions about accountability and transparency, and how the knowledge of power, the power of knowledge is shared and distributed. But there were also strictly scientific questions that required clear thinking, and people who were willing to throw open the question in an honest way. And I think in both those counts, Cambridge distinguished itself. I don't know that there had been another community. I've not heard of a discussion like this, certainly not the local level. But because the federal government chose not to regulate this work directly, and that debate went back and forth for a number of years before 1976, because they chose not to do it, it left this opening. And I hope not only that it is seen as one of the early examples, but maybe even a model, because we have just begun to enter the era of questions that relate to the public impact of technology, certainly through biology. And maybe we'll get to that discussion later on when we talk about where this might be headed. But if somebody knows of another process like this, I would love to hear about it, but I don't.
I guess it's a good time for me to just note that many things, I write about this a lot. I write about things starting at the city when the federal government doesn't do it. And because I work in climate-related areas, the federal government isn't doing it. But yes, Cambridge actually is taking the lead on sustainability programs that we're doing, going net zero on our buildings, all of that. So it's not at all inappropriate to see these kind of, what really are federal questions, come down to the local level, be discussed locally and debated, and then you turn it around and then send it back out to the world. And I think that that's something that makes me very proud to live in Cambridge, because I know this happened with the smoking ordinance, which things start here. We were able to start things here, probably because of that combination of the academic support, the foment at the local level, and and all of our connections. But Robin, what do you think? What do you think about Cambridge?
Oh, I think Cambridge is an extraordinary, sort of interesting place. I was thinking about your question in terms of how to, and this falls back to what I was saying, like things had to go right and a lot of things can go wrong. I know that contemporaneously with the Cambridge recombinant DNA regulation debate, there was some discussion in Somerville as to whether or not to allow a biotech company to set up, and the city of Somerville at that point more or less was emphatically against it. Within the West Coast, which is another major biotech center, Berkeley was such an uncertain environment for companies that you generally find biotech companies in the Bay Area setting up in cities like Emeryville or South San Francisco that are more or less industrial or port cities, where the population there is much more inured to dealing with other types of risk in the sense of chemical pollution, which also comes to the one thing I wanted to stress is that if you think about the types of risk that people are asked to think about, there's sort of something like climate change, which is a global risk that lots of people contribute to. There's something like pollution from a particular plant that's putting smoke or chemicals into the water and air. But the type of concern around this sort of recombinant DNA and biotech really sort of fits into a much older set of concerns about contagion and epidemics. And the thing that makes that such a potent and sort of very vital site for discussing risk is that there's the idea that if just one microbe gets out, that's enough, as opposed to these sort of other types of risk where a lot needs to come out, or if you stop it today, you stop it tomorrow, there's not that much of a difference. But yeah, that idea of infection and contagion and epidemic really calls to mind much more deeply seated human fears, but there are also fears that significantly can get a local response from sort of a local government, which makes it a unique combination of both, scale of threat and scale of action, if that comes to being. And I think that's another way that Cambridge was sort of uniquely cited in the 70s to sort of play that role.
If I can turn it a little bit to the question of innovation overall, because I think we're assuming that this DNA revolution was sort of the beginning of a much larger number of enterprises that became our sort of culture of innovation in Kendall Square and elsewhere in the city. And I just wonder what you think about that. How did it come to pass that one particular, the DNA translated into, you name it, Phil, you can tell me.
Oh.
Autonomous vehicles. How did that turn into autonomous vehicles?
For the same reason before recombinant DNA, the computer industry started here in Cambridge. You have a great inventor. I think it's important when you're talking about innovation to define what you mean by innovation. There is discovery, and that's finding something new about the physical or biological world. There's invention. That's just understanding that a new process can be translated to a useful use of value to society. And then there's innovation. Innovation is taking discoveries and new creative ideas and inventions and making something useful. It has to impact in society, in my opinion, to be an innovation. So why are we such an innovative community? And the reason we are is, first, we have great discoveries in universities. Second, we have a lot of engineers who are involved in invention. And third, we have capital. Venture capital started here in Cambridge. And venture capital is the process of taking risk money and investing it in new ideas and discoveries and translating them into useful products. And that is something deeply seated in this New England community. So we've been innovative in land and the Polaroid camera and Wang and digital and many of the early computer industries. And now we're being innovative in the context of biotech and other things. And we'll be innovative in the context of using IT and information to re-engineer healthcare. But it takes a community to do this. It's not just discovery. It's not just invention. It's a community of investment, know-how, media. It all has to be there to make innovation work. And then you get innovative people who've done this multiple times in your community who know how to make that whole integrated process work. And that's where we're at.
I just want to, before we turn it over to the audience, I wanted to introduce my, probably my favorite idea, which is, but what about the land? And what about the fact that you're in actually the physical space of Cambridge? And did that make a difference? I mean, when you hear about going out to 128, I mean, it wouldn't have worked if everybody went out to 128 to start their businesses. So what about that? What about the physical history? And I have my own ideas, but Sam?
Let me get it started. I think we may have thoughts on all across the panel. One thing that in working with these companies, in walking through labs, talking with small startups, this is only as a sort of a sidebar to the work and that brings me in those labs. But it seems really apparent to me, and perhaps Phil can reflect on this, that one of the reasons it became uniquely important for many of these small companies to be physically near each other, not only was it that there were certain prestige associated with getting venture capital and showing how serious you are by having that zip code. I honestly think that that may have driven some of it. But there's also a unique ecology of the sector, which is perhaps not typical of other emerging technology sectors, where there are technology exchange agreements that go across all of these companies, many small niche players that can do something better than anybody else can do it, and a larger company that doesn't want to invest in the capacity necessary to develop that particular solution, and they literally can have discussions and meetings where they can trade interests in terms of what one specializes in, what another is good at delivering. I think both of those have was not the original plan, but it seems like the dynamic of that work played out in such a way that it was potentially important. You could do some of this through conferencing, et cetera, but I think that the spirit of spontaneity and happy coincidence, and kind of the excitement of the physical environment may have helped as well. But those are a couple of my thoughts.
So I do think that the land and the space matter immensely. Within sort of people discussing the innovation economy, there's been a series of articles and things that people write more or less saying, yes, with teleconferencing, with the internet, with sort of an unprecedented ease of communication, why do people still want to cluster in particular places? And the interesting thing there is that those clusters still really are these vital areas, which suggests that there's a social and community aspect to how this plays out. But I'd once again emphasize that, at least from my historical perspective, that sort of density of stuff within biotech in particular around Cambridge is unique both in the country but also in relation to other sort of innovation-styled industries. And I think another aspect to think about here is biotech is getting most of its financing from sort of the pharmaceutical industry and venture capital, whereas a lot of the early computing and sort of aerospace stuff that was MIT was involved with was very closely tied to the defense industry. And the defense industry likes innovation, but they also really don't like the idea of stuff being tightly clustered in one place the Russians can buy. And so there are other pressures on those industries to spread out, and to also, and there's also pressures for secrecy that are different. And so all these things are to say that there's no one way of having an innovation occur, but in the particular case of Cambridge, you get this very dense cluster of companies all talking to each other and all really thriving on that geographical proximity, which then, of course, means being close is really valuable.
The good news and the bad news for you. The good news is that you're the city of the future, in my opinion, and the bad news is it's a really, really dense city. And I think you're seeing a community farm where people work in clean industry with remarkable high educational levels and input. who want to live next door to where they work and move back and forth by public transportation. And they want to be in Cambridge. They want to be in this town with the community, with the universities, with the connectivity to the airport, to the city. You know, this is a special place. These people, you grew up in Berkeley, I think, and you grew up in Cambridge. I grew up in Kentucky. I know when I'm in a special place, right? Because I didn't grow up there. Cambridge is special. It's a special place to live. And it's very easy to recruit to Cambridge if you're in a company. It's more expensive. Got to pay for it, but it's very easy to recruit it. And that makes this community so special. And it'll continue to grow because I think we have found the niche of circumstances that appeals to the younger generation of people who are at MIT as students and graduate students and postdocs. They want to live in an urban center. They want to have access to an urban center. They don't want to commute for 2 hours in a car. And they want to be in an intellectually, socially, culturally enriched environment. And if that isn't Cambridge, I don't know how you would describe
I don't know where
Cambridge.
that is. Well, I just, before we turn to questions, which will be right away, I'm not sure that everybody realizes that part of the growth of Cambridge in this way is an accident related to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. How many people in the room know that? Well, for those of you who don't know, the reason that the 19 acres that are now available that MIT has become the developer for, the Department of Transportation, was originally NASA. And when Lyndon Johnson became the president, needless to say, he had a preference for Texas. So they don't say, Cambridge, how's it go? Do you read me? We have a problem, Cambridge. They say, we have a problem, Houston. Well, that was an accident that made much of this growth and the new growth that we're going to see possible. So it's your turn now. I want to turn it over to the audience. I know that for questions, we have cards. If anyone wants a card and doesn't want to stand up and do the thing we do in the city council and get your, raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Yes. Please. Oh, you want a microphone? Ah, what an idea.
Thank you. I need a microphone because my voice is going through a transition. I've been in Cambridge for 51 years, so I've seen this radical transformation. And my career was in architecture, so full disclosure. Being here that long, I remember very clearly the heyday of the computer. The Wang, the DEC, the discoveries at MIT, the MITRE Corporation, and then almost overnight, whoosh, it went to Silicon Valley. What lessons are there? Are there lessons that we need to be cognizant of as we think about the future of this incredible new technology here in the city?
I'll try to give that a quick one. I think there really aren't answers. One thing I will say is I think the suburbanization of the computer technology sector was something that was consistent with the type of work that was going on, and there is some clear degree to which the work of research and development in biotechnology is much stickier. I don't want to overstate the point because we don't know what's going to happen, but the investment in the facilities necessary to do this work is not easily transferred to other purposes. The cost of these buildings that we see, people tend to notice the elegant lobby, et cetera, but the cost is enormous because of the requirements for the air handling equipment and much higher performance standards on a lot of the infrastructure of the building to be able to meet the purposes of the work, it's, you know, it's, who knows what will happen to the sector, but it seems less likely by far that we would see that kind of mass migration unless there was some driving purpose that's not occurring to me.
I think there's several things to take note. One of the major things that's happened in the last 15 years is Big Pharma has moved in. And this is Novartis over on Mass Ave. Novartis has probably 2,000 people here in Cambridge working in those laboratories. They have two major, the Nico factory is obviously a Novartis research building, and the building next to it and the building across the street. Pfizer has built two buildings right to the north of MIT. Sanofi is down, bought Genzyme and is down. These are very large capitalized companies that will have significant staying power. And there isn't a small company or another pharmaceutical company in the world that's not got tentacles into Kendall Square. So that gives us a stability. But I do think that the reason all of this happened, well, the reason all of this happened is the rate of advances in biological science. And that has propelled change so fast that big organizations in suburbs have not been able to keep up. And that's why they moved to Cambridge. That's not going to decrease in rate. We have the Broad Institute next to MIT now producing most of the genomic information in the country. It's going to provide a platform for the next decades of biological science growth. We have the big question of how IT will come to medicine. You go to take your car to a garage. They plug it in, and they have a device here that'll look at it and say, oh, you know, this spark plug or this is not functioning. When you go to a doctor, they say, ah, and then they look and they say, oh, you have this problem. And they're right most of the time, but not all the time. And it takes a lot of interaction. We're going to need an integration of information using IT about medical history, behavior and environment, genetics, that will transform healthcare. It'll allow us to diagnose early, it'll allow us to be more precise, and it'll tell us how to treat. And that integration of IT to health, believe me, Google is after it. Believe me, you know, every company is working diligently on it. We have to have that in New England, and that's one of the major challenges that we need to do. But that's the next step along this pathway of health. But beyond that, there's a number of innovations that are going on in this community that's just going to sustain us.
Yes, thank you. I think the comparison with the computing industry is a really interesting one, and I think I'd reiterate that you might look at these things that appear to be high-tech innovation economies, and maybe they look the same from one angle. It's all, you know, it's all computers, it's all biology, but they are industries with very particular internal dynamics that sort of shapes where they'll move and where they'll thrive. And in the case of computing, as I mentioned, I think a big change there is the move from the defense industry being the primary patron of a lot of sort of the computing stuff that was happening around Route 128 to the emergence of the personal computer and the different types of work that involves, the different culture of work that involves. Who, you know, you think of Steve Jobs as sort of like the personal computer versus like the type of person who wants to go work for Raytheon or another large defense contractor. And in the same way, biotech has its moments, and I think the most important one is the one you highlighted, which is the decision by the pharmaceutical industry that Cambridge was going to be the place to invest in. And I mean, I work historically, so if you read biotech industry commentary from the early 90s, they all take it for granted that the Bay Area around San Francisco is the center of biotechnology. And the thing that really sort of the inflection point that changed that for Cambridge really happened relatively recently, and it did have to do with where the pharmaceutical industry decided to put its money, which in turn, of course, goes back to why the pharmaceutical industry suddenly feels that the technology of the future isn't chemical synthesis, which is what it's largely working with around New Jersey, where it's been based for a century, and why this new sort of manipulating life at a genetic level is so important for making targeted therapies, and that has to do with everything from orphan drug legislation to looking at a global level as to what types of drugs they can produce that can't be turned into generic products by somewhere else, and where that technology exists. And the answer for the pharmaceutical industry is that technology exists in and around Kendall Square, and therefore they put their money there, and that sort of has really helped drive this, like, I guess, last decade's worth of expansion.
This is about the nature of the work that goes on in Cambridge that I think also is different from, say, automobile manufacturing or, frankly, a lot of other industries, in that as companies grew, and this has been true since I've been doing this work, they got to the point where they got FDA approval and they could actually manufacture the product that they had been investigating for a while. The second they had a chance to manufacture it, they set that up outside of Cambridge. That has never been the bread and butter of what's going on in the city. It's all about research and development. And as a result of that, it's not actually a loss and was never really the target of those companies to do the manufacturing in the city, because it's all about value added through the information gained. It, I think, has a different dynamic than other traditional manufacturing sectors.
Yes.
It's hard to imagine anything more important to the country and the world than the innovation you're describing. But there's also another dimension that I'm curious about, and that is the parochial or local impact of what's going on here. Certainly you kept our taxes down. But are these companies as good citizens of Cambridge as they could be? Are they contributing to organizations and life and housing development for citizens who can't afford certain rents? And in what way do you think they can do more?
And can I piggyback on that, because I was going to jump in a similar vein about education and science education in particular in the public schools. And so how does all of this help us here? Don't lose his question.
I'm not losing his question. And obviously there's always more to be done. So I'm just making some points. I was told that the biotech industry in Kendall Square now pays $50 million a year in real estate tax. No. I'm inside. We're sitting in a great library. We're sitting next to one of the best schools in the country. Cambridge has benefited enormously out of the development of the values in Kendall. And the names over there on that program, supporting this program, is Anilum. And Anilum I started in 2002. It's a spin out of MIT. It's about this new technology of RNAi. If you look through Cambridge, there is continued investment and community support of these companies in Cambridge. Now, I'm not sure all of them, they couldn't do more. I'm sure they could do more. But they do a lot. I am chair of the committee at MIT for the MIT Museum. MIT Museum brings in, I don't know how many, but close tens of thousands plus of students, many from Cambridge. Biogen is a major supporter of that museum, and the Cambridge Festival. The Cambridge Festival came out of the MIT Museum, and Biogen supports it. And it also has Science on the Wheels, which the MIT Museum runs. So, and all these companies do have laboratories in their structure in which they invite students from Cambridge in and show them this technology. So I know Biogen has those types of labs. I know that Genzyme, when it was there, had. So they do try to be good neighbors. and they do try to support the neighbors, and they do pay taxes. And I think that's a very positive part of what they try to do.
Well, those are, well, let me just say that as extraordinarily valuable as the work you're describing, there are tremendous impacts on life in the city of Cambridge. And maybe you have to do a better public information job, but I don't see a great deal of contribution from the individuals who come and do this valuable work in helping this community to deal with the downside of the economic powerhouse that you're describing. And I would just urge you, to the extent you can influence people, to perhaps bring that message to others.
Yeah, I guess I was going to offer a little bit different perspective, which is that I think the sector overall in most of the observable metrics is among the lowest impact in terms of commuting, the general willingness to be overseen and participate in public accountability. They're seen as a clean industry for good reason. These are all generally to their credit, and I think the issue is bigger than that. It's about the fact that the benefits of that work being held here in Cambridge do accrue to the city and to the city council. It's up to the city to decide what they want to do with those resources at some point. While there is general corporate citizenship issues, I agree. I think the thing that makes it so hard to watch the change that's occurred in Cambridge since I grew up here is that it's been driven by something that there's no single cause to point at, except that we live in a capitalist system, ultimately. And we can't, the one thing people need the most that isn't already accounted for, I think most people can get access to food, not everybody, but most people, is affordable housing. And the city council has made it their mission, to their very credit, over 20 or 30 years, to say, we cannot drop the ball on that. We have to solve that, or try to solve it. And I think the limitations of even the most determined effort locally to try to address that problem are apparent. That the value of property in the city continues to go up, and even the ability of the city to acquire property is limited by that very fact, because it's so expensive to buy property here. And although it's easy to say, well, this all started when the biotech sector came in, separate from the question of the economic impact, I don't know what else we really could ask of that sector, at least in terms of local impact. There may be questions in terms of national policy and access to medication and cost of medication. Those are global and national questions. But in terms of local impact, I think it's more about the fact that we are trapped in a system that determines the supply and demand, indicating the value of property.
It's a good time to put my mayoral hat back on to say that in my experience, both Harvard and MIT were excellent corporate citizens, and that the contribution, the tax contribution is, it's enough to, well, 11% of the city's taxes were paid by MIT. So we're directly benefited financially. And I think the problem is bigger than whether or not there's an interest and a willingness to participate as corporate citizens. There's a need to really look at that, at looking at how we want that kind of participation, how that participation can be best managed. So when I ask the question about STEM education, sometimes people call it STEAM, I think of more almost like a systemic question. What systems should we be taking advantage of because of everybody that's here, because of all these businesses, because of the universities, that could benefit our students. The former superintendent was fond of saying, look here at Woodrow Wilson, at Newtown Court and Washington Elms, right in the shadows of Kendall Square. These students need to benefit from all that's happening here. And there are many reasons that wasn't happening. Look at Saul and think about the just the question of internet access. That this is a problem. You couldn't lay that at MIT's feet or at the city's feet, but there are structural problems with having to do with being impoverished and being not having an education, your parents having an education, or maybe even speaking English, that as a community, including MIT, including Harvard and the businesses, that we need to figure out how to solve. And it certainly was, I believe that the City Council is still working on this, and I urge you all to be a part of that also, because we should be sharing the wealth, so to speak, in terms of all the knowledge that's here, all the potential for education there is for all of our kids. And I just keep that challenge in front of all of us and send it directly to the President's office once again. Because President Reif is very sensitive to this issue himself, having grown up in circumstances that would not have led him to MIT, certainly not to be the president. But we all need to figure out how to make it happen, how to make those connections for these kids, and we don't really know how to do it. So that was the tenor of my question. The housing issue is yet another thing. I'm sure there are others who wish to speak.
You spoke a lot about the origins of the biotech industry in the city, and then how the computer industry sort of left initially through 128 and then to Silicon Valley. Can you hear me? Okay. Can you comment about the processes in the last 10 years that led tech back into Cambridge, right? So Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, all of them are back here. And how resilient are we to potential shocks in the tech industry? Dr. Sharpe commented on, well, the pharma is going to stay here. Is Google going to stay in Cambridge?
Well, I would love to see Amazon here. Well, not in Kendall Square, not all 50,000 for sure. I think Google is here, and the other IT companies, IBM and Microsoft and Amazon in part, primarily for two reasons. One is their major challenge is recruiting talent. And they want to be as close to the talent sources that we have in this town as they can get. And they want to get involved with them early on. And I think that's a major driver for them to be in Kendall Square, which they are. And then a second part of it as well is all of those companies are interested in what is going to be the evolution of IT in health. And how are you going to make your appointment with a physician? How are you going to read information? How are you going to take your genomic information and interpret it? 23andMe, Foundation Medicine, your genome sequence if you have a cancer or if you have a cancer being treated, the first thing they do now is sequence about 500 genes and try to design your therapy around those genes. All of that's information technology. And that's 19% of GDP right now. 19% of GDP. And it's almost all here in this country. So, I mean, that's a big opportunity for those companies. And they're here because they see biotech here, they see the hospitals, they see the innovation here. And they know they have to be here. And the two activities now, I'd love to see those industries become established here, particularly in the health area. I really think it's important. And I think it would grow us and do the right thing in terms of the future of healthcare.
Yeah, so one of the other things that I'm struck by as a historian is that the tech industry, the financial services industry, and the biotech industry are the three, things that the United States economy did better than anyone else starting after about 1980. And the tech industry and the financial services industry have both had substantial crashes. And biotech has had its ups and downs, but it has not really ever cratered. And it is because of the fact that as we're reminded, health spending as a whole is this massive portion of the American economy, and it's only likely to grow greater. And so that association is unique. The thing that has been mentioned implicitly is the association of hospitals with that, and the concentration of hospitals in the Boston area is another factor. But I think the thing that you're highlighting, though, is one of the side effects, or sort of one of the things that's built into the fact that if you have an innovation economy built based on talent, that talent is often represented by a much smaller fraction of the overall industry than other, say the automaking industry or some other large manufacturing industry, and that talent is relatively mobile. So people who are very highly educated, they're in jobs that are making good money, and they're usually towards the younger portion of their life when they're being recruited sort of out of their PhD programs. And that means that these industries need to become incredibly responsive to sort of the desires of that sort of talented group. And right now that talented group, as Phil highlighted, loves living in the center of cities. They love walking to work. They love public transit-based commutes. But that's a relatively new thing. Back in the 50s and the 60s, that group of people, which was also a very different group in the sense it was like largely male, largely white, loved the idea of having a house with a picket fence in the suburbs. And so you see a lot of companies going there, and due to a series of cultural changes that are too complicated to get into here, now the idea of being in a city center is driving not only a lot of concentration around Cambridge, but also, once again, in the Bay Area, you saw Silicon Valley is the place where a lot of companies were founded, and now all those companies are scrambling to get into San Francisco. Companies are scrambling to get into Manhattan. These places that had been places people were, of that cohort were fleeing, are suddenly desirable, and that's wired into things that, once again, extend into American history. And that's something that could change irrespective of what happens economically with the viability of the industry.
Question?
Actually, you sort of talked about what my question was. My question was about the role of the hospital complex around here that was not talked about very much earlier. But I also wanted to take advantage of having the mic to put in a plug for Lyndon Johnson. This is a lesson about history, because even those of us who lived through it, most people believe that because Lyndon Johnson was from Texas, he was the one that moved NASA. But it wasn't. It was Nixon. It was during Nixon's administration that happened. And so, anyway, my question had to do with the medical complex, and whether Boston area actually has such an advantage in that respect that it's going to help to root the biotech pharmaceutical industry here, or whether in fact there are other places like Boston that we don't know about that have lots of hospitals and universities.
Well, hospitals in Boston are much more valuable than just simply the number of patients they have. Mass General and Brigham and Women's and Children's and Dana-Farber are all number 1, 2, or 3 in the country in their respective areas. And they train an extraordinary cadre of people. And many of those people become consultants with the biotech companies. Many of them become employees as MD, PhDs, and can walk and talk both languages, the language of basic science and the language of clinical activity. And every company in Cambridge has a cadre of those people. They're usually head of research or head of clinical development. Sometimes they're senior vice presidents and CEOs. So it's the quality of these hospitals more than anything else in their national, international ranking that is so important to us in terms of keeping this technology and keeping innovation going in this community.
I actually have a question for Dr. Sharpe, if that's all right. Okay. One of the questions of the last, say, 5 or more years around the economics of the pharmaceutical sector is really around pricing and the belief that the U.S. has chosen to take a policy that has been relatively light-handed on not trying to direct or pick winners and losers, so to speak, but also in sort of supporting the pricing available to those pharmaceutical companies by not pushing down prices, as the federal government could very well do if they chose to. That policy is very much in discussion around the country, and I'm just curious if you think that that represents an area that could shift the economics of the sector if a different set of decisions were made going forward.
Well, it certainly would shift the economics of the sector. So the only thing, I understand the issues of pricing. It's a major issue. The 11% of healthcare cost is proprietary pharmaceuticals now. It's gone up, but it's still just 11%. It's not, 90%. But particularly in this innovation sector, investments by various organizations is what allows the long-term development to occur before you get to the market. So I'll give you a specific example, and I pointed out Alnylam over there. Alnylam was established in 2002 here in Cambridge. It was started with some intellectual property that I was involved in at MIT with some other colleagues. The company went public in 2004. It means we were registered on Wall Street and we sold stock. We have invested $2 billion in this technology. We have our first, 15 years after we were established, we have our first positive clinical trial. We announced it about a week ago. The company itself on Wall Street now is worth $10 billion. So this is a financial industry. It's just a way to use the financial to make those investments. So if there isn't return at the end of the day, there's not going to be investment up front. Now, I'm not going to justify the prices. I'm just telling you how it works, and that's the way it works. So, so whatever we do in this process, we should do in a way that allows the industry and the financial system and everything else to adjust over time. But I do think, I look at the numbers, I look at the rate of increase, and there's going to be pressure. There's no question about it.
I'm just curious to know, with the, I think it's fair to say, somewhat hostile attitude towards science coming out of Washington these days, and the potential loss of federal funding, should we be concerned about any negative impacts on growth and development in Harvard Square, not Harvard Square, in Kendall Square, as a result of that loss of federal funding? Or is that just a negative, small negative in the overall picture of growth?
Seems like your question.
I'm totally dismayed by that, many things, but that particular sector. And the good news is that to date, Congress has been willing to continue the funding, and we have not had major decreases in the funding, particularly in health. Now there's been attacks in climate change related science. There's been much more dramatic reductions. The federal investment in R&D, by and large, it supports the more fundamental science, both in biomedical science, life science, physics, chemistry, and others. And the big problem with it is if you cut it down 25%, you're going to see 20 years later, or 15 years later, less innovation. It takes a long time to go from there to innovation, where you really do make a product. So it's something to pay attention to. And the total mindset of Trump in this is just beyond belief for somebody who's ahead of a modern state in which the economy is so tightly coupled to this sector.
Yeah, I would just add that historically speaking, you don't see the National Institutes of Health becoming the dominant player in sponsoring this type of research until the late 50s. And that actually reflects a sea change politically regarding the role that government should have in helping support sort of this basic biological research. And my only point in mentioning that is, unfortunately, the consensus behind an agency like the NIH or the NSF is relatively, historically relatively fragile in terms of it as being a government, good. Yeah, and it requires sort of continual reinforcement. And I do think in that regard, though, that within sort of the science, the science wars, the science, is that medicine always seems to sort of stand to one side of that. And in that regard, the Association of Biological Research with Medicine has helped politically to protect that element of the budget thus far. But I mean, if I'm talking to the people that I'm sure that, Phil knows better than I do, like the impact of the sequester, the impact of flat budgets, all of these are things that will have potentially long-term and devastating impacts on the biological sciences research community.
Question?
Some say biotech is the third university in Cambridge after Harvard and MIT. Do you think biotech will ever leave Cambridge? And if so, why?
I don't think it'll leave Cambridge because I think that 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, we will still have challenges in health that we will want progress made on. And we have a very growing nonprofit sector in Cambridge as well. I mean, we have the Broad Institute, which is associated with Harvard and MIT, but is growing in an enormous pace. The Whitehead, it's another independent foundation. We have the Reagan Institute. We're likely to have more of those. So I think we will see not only growth in the private sector, but we'll see growth in the non-profit sector in this community as well. And the hospitals themselves are substantial. So what will be the shining star of innovation 20 years from now? It could easily be energy and climate. It could easily be energy and climate. And there, how to store electric power, how to transmit it, how to capture it, is all very high-tech questions that we can make major contributions and are making major contributions to. Whether that research can be done in Cambridge, I don't think the fabrication can be done in Cambridge. But we will see challenges of the future, and we may have to build some barriers to the sea because MIT, I think, is probably about 15, 16 feet above sea level. So.
I'll just very briefly say, I think as a historian, I'd reformulate that question to, will the relative prominence of the Cambridge area fade? And my answer is that it might. And I mean, due to many of the same factors that make it such a desirable location now. I mean, you can only get so many companies into a given space. These lifestyle factors we've been talking about in terms of where your talent can be recruited to may shift for reasons that we can't foresee. And other places haven't quite figured out sort of the Kendall Square, code yet, but it doesn't mean they're not trying. And there's lots of places that are investing very heavily in trying to sort of recreate that type of density, and one of them very well might succeed at the same time that something else happens in Cambridge to make it slow down, and that could bring up another place. Just only to say that the factors that converge on Cambridge historically may also change with time, but I don't think you're going to see the evaporation of the industry, but at the same time it's a dangerous thing as a historian to say, given the industries that were here 50 years ago, that would have seemed so permanent. So as a historian, I can say it's unpredictable.
Well, actually, that leads to the thing that I wanted to ask. The crystal ball is getting clearer and clearer about Harvard's expansion in Alston-Brighton, and clearly that's an area where they're building a science hub. They're hoping to, I don't know how they would describe it, but expand on the success of Kendall Square. And I wonder what you think, how you think that's going to play out. What impact might that have? I can think immediately on that there'll be makes more land available for these endeavors. Perhaps that takes the pressure off some of that land, makes some different kinds of endeavors possible here.
I'm just thinking back to previous attempts Boston has made to try to reproduce the combination of factors, and they called it Biosquare, and it was the result of proximity to the BU Medical Center, as well as a lot of available open land that was not being otherwise used along the crosstown corridor. The final piece, the cherry on the sundae, was supposed to be the National Emerging Infectious Diseases Laboratory, which is the BSL-4 lab that was federally funded and put there and kind of fast-tracked through, quite honestly. Didn't go through a lot of community process, and the result of that we have seen, that it took a decade for there to be real buy-in, and even now I think people feel that they were kind of forced into it. But all of that was to try to reproduce the external environment that they observed across the river, and it really didn't result in what they had hoped it would. I do think the idea of a kind of a university-industry partnership in the new Alston campus is probably more likely to be a good model for Boston. And I would be surprised if companies didn't take advantage of it. Cambridge is so expensive per square foot that a lot of companies really struggle to even find a place when they are able to expand. They still can't, whatever they pay. So it's hard to believe that those pressures don't exist and that they wouldn't probably have a better environment in that kind of campus environment, I would think.
I'd just say this, from a national point of view, the fact that Harvard is expanding their engineering and becoming much more prominent in engineering and technology is so important for the country and for this whole New England economy. It is to be celebrated without question. And, you know, the competition is going to float all boats. Let's see it. Bring it on. That is all positive as far as I'm concerned, but I think it'll be a great step forward by the community.
Interestingly, I think it's going to have a big impact on transportation in the area. That as you say, all boats will float. The kind of the transportation nexus that's possible going across through Brighton and Alston. And all of that is going to make the city bigger in a way, bigger in a smaller area. In other words, they'll have a sense of expansion of more land will be available, truly available, because people will be able to connect with one another. And I think that's all positive, and that's why you should all be interested in what's happening with this thing called West Station. Near Boston University, that the Department of Transportation, MassDOT, is not too excited about talking about a better transportation nexus until it's really, really needed. But it's really, really needed to be thinking about it right now in order to make it happen in the next 10, 15, even 20 years. And having the vision of looking across the river through the new Harvard Science Center to connect over to Alston, Brighton, and all of that is to the benefit of all of us. You want to describe the Mass Turnpike? I am the Cambridge community representative to the I-90 process, so I'm supposed to know about this. But can I describe it? Well, you all understand that the Mass Turnpike, the bridge that's bringing the Mass Turnpike toward Cambridge is crumbling. They call it the viaduct. And so MassDOT needs to rebuild the road either up there or down low. And as they're doing that, they're also considering all these other transportation ramifications, including the thing that Kathy Zusi and I have talked about a lot. How are we going to get to Cambridge from the Mass Turnpike? Because that too is a little bit, the particulars of that are up in the air. But as they're considering that, Cambridge planners, probably more than anybody, are talking about how mass transit is going to be transformed. And for those of us who live in Cambridge, and this wonderful panel got here, maybe one in a car, one in a car, one in a bike, one in a car, one in a bike, one on the T, and one walked. So this is kind of a profile of getting around in Cambridge, but that's not the profile of getting around in the greater Boston area. And this is the potential to make that getting around much better, bring people to Kendall without driving, send them over to Harvard if that's where they're going to go without driving, all of that. We all need to be very supportive of that and look to the future as that area that was formerly the rail yards and kind of a no man's land and a kind of blank spot maybe in your brain for what was over there anyway. That's not going to be like that anymore. No more rail yards, they're gone. And so there's a lot of change coming. Other questions? Saul got the microphone.
Hi, this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all. But I want to go back to the question of place and land and location with a comment and a question. My version of, why didn't NASA show up here is very different. I happened to be in Houston a few months ago touring NASA and had a chance to ask Houston historians why NASA is there. And they're of the belief that NASA was always going to be in Houston, and they can point to the way Houston annexed local towns, in the direction of the land where they were going to put NASA, years before as part of planning for NASA. So whatever the truth of the story really is yet to be discovered. But, plus they raise cows next to NASA. That's not something they would ever have done in Cambridge. Anyway, seriously, there are cows right there.
And the question is?
The question is, the inner belt. I've always been under the impression that a lot of the available land, for the biotech industry came about because of preparations for the stopping of the inner belt. I mean, things like simplex wire and cable was under threat by, the inner belt, etc. Am I just making that up? Was there really, was the fact that land was cleared for a highway that was never built, part of what led there to be fertile ground for biotech?
I think it's a second stage. That then I think Tech Square was a very important milestone in building, and that was not an inner belt related thing. A third of the so I think it's MIT made land available. I think the connection was Sloan to me. I wonder if you can comment on that. That the business connection that MIT very at some point consciously, maybe that's not the right word to use, understood that in order for business to become involved in science, that you had to connect those two things together. And so the creation of Technology Square made it possible for business to locate close to MIT. And you were the prime example of that. No, but you exactly did that. I mean, you came and started a business related to MIT, and that's not actually the Harvard model so much at all, which is another.
As I pass this, I believe there are people here who know quite specifically, but I believe the path of the inner belt was closer to Central Square.
Yeah.
So these may be, right, yeah.
MIT's, it's interesting to contrast MIT. If you're at MIT, you realize it's a permeable institution. It looks outside itself to engage the world. And part of that is because if you're an engineer, you have to engage society to be a successful engineer. All right, you need problems to solve. They are out there in companies and out there in public health and everything in public services, and they go out. So MIT developed after, as a new age 15, they came to Cambridge, and they really grew at World War II. So we never had the sort of wall around the central part of the university as a retreat. That's never been the model of MIT. It's a model of most of the older universities, but not of MIT. It's a permeable institution. And bringing industry close to MIT and investing in making that happen nearby would be inherent in the philosophy of the place. But what I want to see done is I want to see that railroad track that runs through Lower Cambridge turned into a subway extension line, an urban line that goes west to east. It would really take enormous commuting pressure out of Cambridge. And it's the only connection between North Station and South Station. So that's why they have to run those trains. It's the only way to get a train from North Station to South Station. That's why I think in the Big Dig they had a train connector between North and South that would have taken that pressure off. But that's used 3 times a day. I mean, you could turn that into a commuting source that would really change the dynamics of living in Cambridge.
We heard of the inner belt, that's the urban ring. The urban ring. And for a long time there was a lot of, I don't know if anybody here is sort of up to date on the urban ring, but there was a lot of discussion about it for a long time. It's a hugely expensive project, and I think that it's sitting waiting for the right moment. But the right moment, I don't know when that's good. And that's part of what Harvard's development in Alston, Brighton might very well do, is push the development of that urban ring and trains that would run across the Grand Junction Railroad and up through Kendall. There are plans out there, but there's nowhere near funding. And I think a lot of other things, falling down bridges and so on, probably push that other way. Plus, you don't have the federal government supporting mass transit in the way that you really need for a project like that. So stay tuned on the urban ring. Question? Oh, maybe we'll give somebody else who hasn't had an opportunity. Anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak who has a question before we go? You get a repeat?
And just a plug and a comment. The plug is for the Cambridge Historical Society sponsored a walk in Kendall Square a couple of weeks ago. There were only about 20 of us that did it, but it was mind-altering to find out what's going on behind those glass walls. My suggestion is to encourage the biotech community to advertise in your lobbies. What the Koch Center is done, those beautiful circular paintings, is good. It brings you in one time, but I don't think it'll bring you back. But understanding the vitality of the research and the discoveries that's going on down there, I think would be good for you and for the community.
I just, as somebody who used to be on the board of the Cambridge Science Festival, I'll tell you that the Cambridge Science Festival, which is a week or 10 days in April, does just that, opens the doors and makes transparent what's going on inside those buildings. So when you see those banners up about the Cambridge Science Festival, yes, there are a lot of activities for children, and they're wonderful, but there are activities for adults to go in and really see what's going on in the labs, and make sure to make your way to that website and find out and get the tickets ahead of time for how to make beer or how to taste chocolate. You won't regret it. I mean, a lot of wonderful activities happening there. But and another answer to that is that that's a planning board function. The planning board brought you those paintings in the Koch Center. The planning board brought you the what's going on the ground floor level in the Broad, and I'm not sure that as many of those are as successful as they ought to be, but the concept is there at an institution you know well, the planning board, where they think about those kind of design elements. I think one of the things that's been the drumbeat, and anybody who's been to council meetings in recent years knows that the drumbeat is make it more lively on the ground floor. Why is it so dead at night? why isn't there anybody here on the weekend? Why, you know, why aren't there more people flowing? And I think some of that has come to be successful as there have been more businesses, and there have been, well, raise your hand if you've been to a Kendall Square restaurant lately, or wish you could go more often because you would like to afford it. I'm raising my hand on that one. So I mean, I think that there's a wonderful change, though it looks like Washington D.C. to me. That's a little odd, but maybe Maryland. I don't know, but it's definitely lively. And I had the pleasure of showing, I think that somebody from CDC around Kendall Square and standing near the canals and looking around at all the buildings and realizing when you get back into it off of, say, Main Street or off of Broadway, and you get onto some of those kind of like campus-like streets, it's really quite lovely in Kendall Square. And I urge you all, as we're closing our time here, to make your own tour. If you didn't go on the Historical Society's tour, make sure you go with your family and friends and check it out, rent a canoe, maybe a kayak, something like that, and check out the river. I want to give, are there any more questions? If not, I'm going to give my panelists an opportunity to say one last thing before we close out. Robin, now that you're here, you've been here for 3 years and 2 days, 3 years, what would you like to tell us?
Well, I grew up in Berkeley, California, as I said, and the thing that I was struck by walking through the campus as a kid was it was a construction zone. And the buildings that were going up were buildings devoted to research, largely in the life sciences and biology. And when I came to Kendall Square and started working, my office is also a construction zone. It probably will be for the next 10 years, and that's a testament to the type of activity and the hope that's invested in it. And I was a chemistry major. I find this stuff incredibly cool. I love the idea of curing disease, but I also think that it is important to make sure that the good of all of that activity is distributed as widely as possible, and that is a question that, as my mother, who's an urban planner, would be happy to hear, I think leads us into broader questions about American history and zoning and politics, and those are the questions that I think are very important to keep asking about this development as it progresses.
Very good. I endorse that comment entirely. I also think there are questions about equity, health equity, and equity in general that come out of this, and I think that as Cambridge has added, I think, a lot of value to the public policy discussion that's helped to give firmer ground to the sector back in the 70s. We also have the benefit of a lot of advantages, and therefore I believe the obligation to participate in a broader conversation that should be a public one about the ethics of medicine, about the ethics of the modern applications of the technology that's being developed in our city. Those may include things that involve CRISPR, the public release of genetically altered organisms in order to save lives, with consequences that aren't entirely known. These kinds of conversations, I think, we're uniquely suited to begin a discussion. It should not end here, but because of our history of a willingness to have public participation in questions around science, intent, and ethics, I think we should think bigger in terms of the role that we play. And again, this is a global conversation, but I think we have advantages that give us a certain obligation to have that kind of conversation. So I look forward to that.
I just want to thank you. Thank Cambridge for being Cambridge and a place that I've been able to work and make a difference. And thank Cambridge for being an audience like you. I mean, your questions have been really informative and thoughtful, and it's so much a pleasure to be in a community that cares, thinks, has questions, and gets involved. So just thank you for being Cambridge.
Henrietta, do you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Oh no, it's been an honor to moderate this panel, and I've been so pleased, as everybody else has, with the questions and with the quality of the panelists, and I would ask you to give them one more round of applause.
I second all of that. One, what a intelligent and beautiful audience we have, and also to our speakers. I'd like to also thank our sponsors for this event. And if anyone here found value in what they learned tonight, I'm assuming you learned a few things, maybe just a show of hands. I learned something new. I'm going to think about something in a different way. Those are our goals here at the Society. So a lot of groundwork was laid here tonight for our next discussion on October 18th, and that's going to be at Google, Cambridge, Belly of the Beast. So if you haven't been, that's a beautiful space. Maybe they'll let us play ping pong, or we'll just learn. And I look forward to seeing you there, and thank you for coming.